So, finally getting a chance to discuss my thoughts on the encounter between the British and the Russians in the Black Sea, which thankfully, I thought I was going to just sort of let this news story pass by. There were other people who talked about it. I thought it got a fair bit of play. But it's actually still relevant now. So now that I have the chance, we do have some new developments as far as this is concerned. So I'll go over briefly sort of what originally happened and then what the new news we have now and what sort of the ongoing situation is. So the Black Sea, for, I guess, most people who listen to me are American, not European, so might very well not know where the Black Sea is. The Black Sea is sort of adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea. If you go through the Mediterranean, up through the Bosporus, past Constantinople, that little strait, that little bit of water that separates Europe from Asia, you go through there, you get into the Black Sea. And there are quite a few countries who have borders, or who have coastline along the Black Sea. It's Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Russia, Turkey, and Georgia. And the Black Sea also happens to be home to the Crimean Peninsula, a little plot of land which was the subject of a historically important war in the 19th century involving the British, the French, the Russians, and the Turks, perhaps other nations as well. I don't quite remember the details. But now it seems as though the British are interested in starting a new Crimean War with the Russians, which seems odd to me. Britain is not the same country that it was back in the 19th century. They're no longer, to say the least, the great empire that they once were. They lost their empire after World War II. Although I guess to be more accurate, they really lost it after World War I, but it took until after World War II for things to really come apart. But World War I is what sunk the British. I mean, financially, they were never the same after that. But the British media and British politicians the political class in general, I guess I should say, seemed to have a strange obsession with Ukraine, with the Maidan Revolution of 2014, and with the Russian annexation of the Crimean Peninsula after the Euromaidan Revolution. Now, again, just to briefly go over this for people who don't remember the exact details behind it, the Crimean Peninsula is the site of a Russian naval base that has been there for I don't know how long. I would imagine that the Russians have probably had a naval base there since the 19th century, certainly predating the Soviet Union. But because of the way that the Soviet Union divided up the Russian Empire into these, what were they, 13 or 11? I can't remember exactly how many Soviet socialist republics that were essentially administrative divisions. It's not like these were real, in effect, separate nations. I mean, the Soviet Union was governed from Moscow. It was a highly centralized, bureaucratic mess. But nevertheless, when the Soviet Union collapsed, each of the former Soviet socialist republics became its own, independent nation. And so therefore the Crimean Peninsula, which historically had been a part of the Russian Empire, it was a part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And so the Russians, nevertheless, wanted to keep their naval base there, and they did. And as far as they're concerned, they've always had a naval presence there. That is I believe, their only warm water port for their navy, if I remember correctly. Because the ports up in the north of Russia, what is it? Is it Archangel, I think is the city? Or I'm sure there's others up in the north of Russia around the Arctic, where they do have these big ports where they could, dock naval ships, but not in the winter. I believe it freezes over and it's just not practical. And so Sevastopol, or Sevastopol, not exactly sure how people pronounce it over in the East. I've heard British and Americans pronounce it differently. I think Sevastopol is what the Brits say, although I don't know if that's necessarily more or less correct than Sevastopol. But, I'm letting this go on way too long. After the Euromaidan revolution of 2014, which was a pro-EU, pro-NATO coup against the otherwise sort of Russian-friendly, although he kind of tried to play both sides, government of Viktor Yanukovych. And it was clear to the Russians that, if the regime in Kiev was going in the direction of NATO, then that was a threat to their naval position in Sevastopol. And so the Russians moved in to do what they could to make sure that the Crimean territory was no longer under the rule of the Kiev government. And the case that they made was that the people who lived, on the Crimean Peninsula identified with the Russian nation and considered themselves to be Russian people. And so, therefore, if the Ukrainian government was going to go in a very strong, hardline Ukrainian nationalist direction and do things like ban the Russian language and try and stamp out any vestige of Russian culture within Ukraine's borders, well, then, the Russians should step in and bring the Crimean Peninsula under their wing. And so they held some kind of referendum, which, as far as international law is concerned, is plenty good enough for annexing territory. If you have, a decent percentage of the population of some territory that says we don't like the government that's currently ruling us and we want to be a part of some other government, you can't make a very strong moral argument as to why they should remain under the rule of the other one. So I guess the only thing you can really criticize is say, well, it was a fraudulent election or something like that. You can pull a Trump and get mad at election fraud, although I'm told by the media here in the United States that we're not supposed to question the integrity of elections. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to assume that the referendum in Crimea on joining the Russian Federation was totally above board, and that there was absolutely no ballot stuffing or voter intimidation or voter suppression in any way. But, let's be fair. Obviously, the reason why the Russians wanted to take over the Crimean Peninsula and were less interested in taking over the other Russian, the other Russian ethnic Russians in Ukraine, taking them under their wing, the folks who lived in the Donbass region, was because of Sevastopol and the importance of that naval base. The fact of the matter is that Donbass is not strategically important in any way. And so, Putin is not going to stick his neck out and try and annex those territories. But, the Crimea is a little bit of a different, it's a different story. And so the Russians have made it clear that Crimea is part of their country, and it's going to remain that way for the foreseeable future. So fast forward to the Brits sailing around in the Black Sea, which seems kind of strange. The Black Sea is a pretty remote place. As I described to you, you have to go sail through the narrow little Bosporus to get from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. And once you get there, there's not a whole lot to do. The coastlines of all these countries. Think about it. It's Eastern Europe. It's not. What are you going sailing up there for? In that much time, you could have gone through, the Suez Canal or something, I guess. And although I guess there's not much to see once you get through the Suez either, unless you're going to India, maybe. But obviously, what the Brits were trying to do is they wanted to sail close to the Crimean Peninsula, close enough to trigger a reaction from the Russians, who I guess scrambled some jets and fired some warning shots at the British to get out of their territorial waters. Now, it wouldn't be totally clear that this was Britain trying to provoke the Russians, and if the Brits didn't put a BBC reporter on board of this ship, before sailing into Russian territorial waters. If this was just an isolated incident where some British ship, strayed into what Russia considers to be its territorial waters, and there was some kind of warning shots fired, and that was it, oh well, they might have made a mistake. But you don't put a reporter on the ship and then sail into Russian waters and then have this whole media firestorm that you try and start. Obviously, what the British wanted was to provoke some kind of aggressive reaction out of the Russians that they could then take and spin and say, oh my gosh, look at all of this Russian aggression. And perhaps they would have been happy if the Russians did even more than fire warning shots. Maybe they wanted the Russians to actually, shoot and hit them. But beyond that, I don't quite understand what the British were going for here. I think, like many people, I am rather perplexed at what Boris Johnson thought that there was to be gained in this situation, because obviously something like this wouldn't happen without the Prime Minister's knowledge. I don't think that the British Navy is out trying to provoke foreign leaders into attacking their ships without consulting the Prime Minister. And if that was the case, then whoever ordered this should be fired. But the fact that there have been no firings at the British Navy and no disciplining of any officers would seem to indicate to me that Boris Johnson is very much in favor of this. And if so, why? What is there to be gained here? I mean, are the Brits trying to provoke sort of a mini Pearl Harbor and get the Russians to attack their navy so that they can justify so they can get into some kind of war with Russia? I mean, Britain's not the country it used to be, one. So Britain, could not do that. I mean, the Black Sea is very far away from Britain. They have no business sailing their military over there, and even if they do, there's nothing they can do. I mean, the Brits don't have a big enough, navy to mount some kind of invasion force and take over Russia via the Black Sea. And again, putting all that aside, Russia's a nuclear power. You can't start wars with nuclear powers. Countries that have nuclear weapons can't go to war with each other. That's not okay. That's something you have to avoid at all costs. It doesn't matter whether you try and blame it on the other guy and say, oh, well, he started it. It's like, I don't care who started it. If you start a thermonuclear war, whoever contributed to that, whoever didn't do their damnedest to de-escalate the situation, is responsible in large part for the what inevitably would be the deaths of millions of people and the devastation of a good chunk of the planet. So that's the background. I didn't think it would take me 12 and a half minutes to get to this, but the big news coming out today, or I guess I don't know if it's big or not, is that now you thought it was ridiculous that the Brits were trying to pick a fight with the Russians. Now it appears that the little tiny Netherlands, the Dutchmen, are also trying to pick a fight with the Russians. Now I don't know the details yet, so I guess I can't say that entirely. It is possible that this time it was Russian aggression, but right after we have a pathetic attempt by the British at some kind of false flag trying to frame up some act of Russian aggression, it's hard for me to believe that there was a legitimate case of Russian aggression against the Dutch, especially since the Dutch also are claiming that this happened in the Black Sea. And so what it seems here is we have NATO countries trying to provoke Russia into shooting at their naval ships. And I remember not too long ago, the U.S. Coast Guard was sailing around in the Black Sea, which again, it seemed absurd. I mean, the U.S. Coast Guard is supposed to patrol, the American coasts. The Black Sea is nowhere near the coasts of America. I mean, they're not even the American Navy. There's no pretense under which the Coast Guard should ever be in the Black Sea, ever. The Coast Guard should not leave whatever side, whatever ocean, whether the Coast Guard happens to be stationed on the East Coast or the West Coast, they should either stay in the Atlantic Ocean or stay in the Pacific Ocean. There's nowhere else that the U.S. Coast Guard should ever be. And then after that, or maybe it was a little before that, the U.S. also was sailing around destroyers in the Black Sea, peacocking in front of the Russians at Sevastopol. I mean, what is all this? It just comes across as impotent to me. They're just trying to, strut their stuff in front of the Russians. What are they what are they going to do? Is this supposed to scare the Russians? I mean, I don't see why it would. I mean, all this looks to me as someone who is from the United States, which of course is the epicenter of the Western world, and is the spearhead of foreign policy coming out of the West, it would just appear to me that my civilization is spiraling in terms of foreign policy. Things are becoming more and more erratic, unpredictable, and nonsensical. I mean, if you thought that the Iraq War was a blunder, think about it if they actually baited Russia into some kind of war in the Black Sea. That doesn't even compare to the blunder of the Iraq War. Like I said before, they're dealing with a nuclear-armed state. You don't screw with people like that. You try and be as friendly with them as possible and make sure you're all on good terms. All nuclear-armed countries should be on the same side. And if you have nuclear-armed countries that aren't on the same side, the nuclear-armed states should all be working diligently to mend their differences and to make nice, to ensure that the world is always as far away from any potential nuclear war as possible. Are we just supposed to assume that if the Brits provoked some kind of war with Russia, that would then, of course, rope in all of the NATO states, whether they be the French, the Germans, the Dutch, the Americans, the Canadians, the Poles? Are we just supposed to assume that the Russians will just be good losers and not use their nuclear weapons and just allow all the NATO countries to just come in and defeat them? Even if the Russians didn't immediately launch their nuclear weapons, if there was ever some kind of war between NATO and Russia, if it ever got to the point that it looked like NATO was going to win and was going to, I don't know, capture Moscow or something, and Putin was going to have to, take a cyanide capsule to avoid being prosecuted for, whatever Holocaust they blamed him for. Do you really think that at that point the Russians still wouldn't use their nuclear weapons? I mean, this is beyond childish. I think it's safe to say that throughout the Western world, in the folks who are sort of the foreign policy leaders, your foreign ministers, your foreign secretary, as it's known in the UK, your secretary of state in the US, as well as the secretaries or ministers of defense in all these countries, the NATO secretary general, all of these people, I think, should be considered unserious and dangerous. Because say what you will about Putin's domestic policy, I would not want to live under Putin's rule. Not a fan of how things are in Russia. I like being free. I'm not free in the U.S., but I'm freer, I think, than I would be in Russia, in many areas in which, that's important to me. But in terms of foreign policy and how Putin conducts himself and how Lavrov conducts himself in dealing with countries outside of Russia, they're far more measured and reasonable than the U.S. or any of its puppet regimes in Western Europe. I have no fear that Putin or Lavrov or whoever the defense minister is now is going to cause some kind of great war, or that they're going to attack somebody out of the blue and cause some great suffering and start a war that's going to kill tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Because their track record shows that that's not what they're interested in. And I think quite rationally, because I think, actually Putin has said as much publicly, not a good idea for nuclear-armed countries to go to war with each other. Just wouldn't work out well. And yet you look at the track record here in the West since the end of the Cold War, what's it been? War after war after war. And it's not like the Europeans opposed all of them. A lot of them the Europeans were quite in favor of. I mean, look at, Tony Blair with Iraq. Blair doesn't deserve as much blame as Bush, but he deserves a lot of blame for the Iraq War. I guess, the French dissented, but again, there were plenty of other cases, I'm sure, where where France and the other European countries had plenty of opportunity to right their any perceived dovishness. So I know nobody's listening, particularly nobody in positions of power with regard to foreign policy, but I would implore you, if any of you ever do hear this, please stop being stupid and stop acting like children. And playing this, I don't know. I guess it's a matter of dumb pride, just looking at it going, well, I don't like those Russian guys. They just, they walk around like they own the place and all this. They get mad over optics and decorum. And these folks would start wars over issues like that. I mean, just admit that the Euromaidan revolution backfired, and that you might have gotten folks in control of Kiev who are who would totally give their lives to support NATO and the EU, and would kiss your boots every time you come to Kiev or every time you invite them to Brussels. But keep in mind that when you did that, the reaction to that, the response to that by the Russians, was to annex the Crimean Peninsula and just accept that wasn't that you don't like that trade and that you feel like you made a bad trade. I mean, these folks just can't help but be bitter. When it was they started their fight in geopolitics, they decided that that they played the game and they lost one round, and they can't handle it. So that's about all I have to say on the Black Sea situation for the time being. So I guess I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.